So, that being said, let's go into the question of skepticism. Because in philosophy, one of the branches of philosophy is this thing called epistemology. Epistemology means the study of knowledge. Like, how can we really know things? How do we come to know things? Can we know things? And skepticism is one take on epistemology. But I think a correct take on epistemology is sort of like two sides of a coin. There are epistemological virtues that if we are to be rational, we should try to maximize both these virtues. And there is a virtue of skepticism where we say, essentially the idea there is that, like, if anything is not true, I don't want to believe it. Or I want to minimize how many false beliefs I hold. But the flip side of the same coin is a virtue of knowledge, an epistemological virtue of knowledge. I want to maximize how many true beliefs I hold. And as many truths as I can believe, I want to believe as many true things as possible. And so these are sort of twin truths here. The problem you run into is that a lot of times teenagers only see the skepticism side of the coin, and they don't see the value of knowledge, which is the other side of the same coin. Okay, so to analyze basic skepticism, remember, basic skepticism is just the idea that nobody knows anything. So, like, let's just go through some simple illustrations to show that it is possible to know things. So, for example, a simple mathematical equation would be 1 plus 1 equals 2. Do you really doubt that 1 plus 1 equals 2? I've had teenagers tell me that 1 plus 1 could equal 37. I think when I say that, they're not really thinking about what they're saying. Because this is what the philosopher David Hume called an analytic truth. 1 plus 1 is just another way of writing 2. So it's like we're saying 2 equals 2. And one interesting example I had with a teenager who said, 1 plus 1 could equal 37. I said, well, can 3 equal 4? And he was like, no. They have all sorts of arguments where they try to get out of this, which really illuminates the problem. I had a teenager tell me, well, I've had more than one teenager tell me, anytime I try to prove anything mathematically, they say, well, numbers don't exist. And one teenager told me, what are numbers anyway? Well, I mean, that's a whole philosophical question from metaphysics. This is not really about knowledge in epistemology, but in metaphysics, there's this question of whether or not numbers exist and logical truths exist. I lean towards nominalism. I don't think numbers exist, but what I told the teenage boy and what I've told a teenage girl too is like, but when the universe came into existence, like, it couldn't come into existence in a way that 1 plus 1 equals 37. And, just because I can't give you a full and complete definition of what a thing is, that doesn't mean we don't know anything about a thing. In logic, that's called a faulty dilemma fallacy or a false dichotomy. It's like if I was to ask you, do you want, the classic one is like, have you stopped beating your wife? Yes or no? You've got two options there. Obviously there's other options, like you're never married, you're a woman, you're married to a man, you are paraplegic and you couldn't possibly have ever beaten your wife, but in this case it's like, they say, you can't tell me what the thing is, so it doesn't exist, and so therefore numbers don't exist, so there's no way to know anything about numbers. It's like, no. Just because you don't know anything about a thing doesn't mean, or just because you don't know everything about a thing doesn't mean you don't know anything about a thing. You don't have to know everything about something to know something about something. There's a third option where we know some things about a thing. I mean, because in reality, I don't know if there's ever a situation where philosophers would all have a consensus that, like, we've got a complete definition of a thing. it's very difficult to like have a complete one like that. So anyway, we'll move forward to another illustration that I like to use, and this is the one that got one of the teenage boys. It's gotten a lot of people, actually. I had a scientist who told me that, that the only source of knowledge is observational knowledge. So he was skeptical of philosophical knowledge, but then so that's like a form of local skepticism, but he believed in scientific knowledge. And this is an old view called verificationism. Today it's called Scientism. We're going to take a look at it later. But the thing is, you can know things purely philosophically or purely mentally, or what's in philosophy is called a priori knowledge. Knowledge that is prior to observation, versus a posteriori knowledge, which is knowledge that comes from observations. We'll get to that later, so we'll just go into this example, because what I'm trying to do with these examples is help people see the basic intuition that we can know things. So, take a shoebox and put 3 gold watches in it, and put it up in the attic, and then go downstairs and wait 1 year, and then go back up to the attic and open the shoebox, and you find 4 gold watches in the shoebox. What will you conclude? You may conclude that you forgot and actually put 4 in there. You may conclude that somebody put 1 in there. What you would never conclude is that the number 3 equals the number 4. The number 3 equals the number 4. That's, ridiculous. And I think that example a lot of times cuts through a lot of this nonsense, because a lot of times I'll say 1 + 1 = 2, and they've got all these fancy arguments that they've come up with. One that I hear very, very often is that numbers are just made up, and teenagers a lot of times have a difficulty seeing the difference between the fact that, like, the word for 4 was made up, but that doesn't mean that the number 4 was made up. Just like it is imaginary. Like, you are called, I don't know, whatever your name is, Jim, but like that doesn't mean, if we had called you something else, you would still exist. It doesn't mean that you're made up just because the name that we assigned to you was made up. In other languages, they have different words for to counting to 10. Like in Spanish, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4 in English. In German, 9 means no, but in English, it's a number that comes after 8 and before 10. But they're just names that we assign to things. Anyway, with that gold watch example, I think people recognize that, like, you would be willing to accept any explanation that, like, watches got together and made watch babies before you accept that the number 3 equals the number 4. Okay? So what that would be is, well, then, if that's the case, then it's like, okay, well, then we know something. We know that that explanation for what happened in that shoebox is incorrect. We know that at least. So that's the idea with skepticism, is like, basic skepticism seems fundamentally flawed. We'll get to that. Here's another example. Let's say that, like, Jim and Sally and Bill are in the room, and the door is shut, and they're all in the room, and Jim says that there's a cat outside the room, and Bill says that there's 2 cats outside the room, and then Sally wants to be the peacemaker, and Sally says, you're both right. And then Bill says, no, there's only 1 cat outside the room, and Jim says, no, there's definitely 2 cats, there's more than 1. And Sally says, oh, you're both right. I think we can all see that there's no way Sally can be right. Regardless of any observations, we don't have to open the door to know that Sally's wrong. So we know that Sally's wrong. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about basic skepticism is we can know basic skepticism is wrong, by analyzing it in this way, because, when the skeptics say that nobody knows anything, the obvious question is, well, how do you know that nobody knows anything? What if somebody somewhere knows something? And the problem with basic skepticism is it's self-contradictory. It destroys itself. It denies the thing that it affirms. Another way to think of it is if someone was to say, there are no true statements, there are no true sentences, or this sentence is not true. Well, is it true that the sentence is not true? Or someone might say, well, there's no absolute truth. Well, is that absolutely true? So what we have in this situation is what's called self-contradictory statements. And basic skepticism is a self-contradictory statement because they're claiming to know that nobody knows anything. And it appears that the skeptics back in the ancient world, in ancient Greece, 550 BC, probably didn't believe basic skepticism for very long. We're not sure if they ever believed it in the basic sense because of this problem. They probably moved to something called academic skepticism, which we'll talk about in a minute. But before that, we want to make sure we kind of beat this one in. I remember I had a group online who tried to tell me that, how do I put it? That what I'm talking about is something called the Law of Non-Contradiction, that a self-contradictory statement cannot be true. And this group online said, oh, you believe that? You're so crazy and dumb. The Law of Non-Contradiction is circular reasoning. And well, that's actually wrong. The Law of Non-Contradiction is not a form of circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is, or AKA begging the question, is when you say, like, I'm right because I'm never wrong. Where you prove what you're saying by just saying it again with different words and pretend that that functions as evidence or proof. It doesn't work that way. But a self-contradictory statement is what's coming out of the skeptic's mouth, and it is self-destructive. It's not circularly affirming. It's not proving A with B, but when B is actually just A written another way. So A is true because A is true would be circular reasoning. But a self-contradictory statement is something like, A is the same thing as not A, or like, I know that I can't know anything. That's not simply wrong, it's meaningless because it denies what it affirms. So this is one of those basic epistemological intuitions that you can't, like, the first time you see it, a lot of times people struggle with it, but it becomes kind of clear to them once they think about it a little bit. And essentially what we're doing is we're observing concepts or ideas purely mentally. And as long as we understand the identity of those concepts, then we can see that this identity excludes the other one, that they're exclusive. Like, 3 does not equal 4. And you can't have no true statements and a true statement. And if that statement's true, then there's no way the statement no true statements, there are no true statements, is true, because for it to be true, there has to be a true statement. So here's some other examples of some self-contradictory statements. Everything changes, right? Does the fact that everything changes change? Or be more open-minded. You should always be more open-minded. Well, the problem with that is that, like, are you open-minded towards being closed-minded? Another example is the Oprah's religion example, where she says all religions teach basically the same thing. I was told by one public school teacher that like they're actually instructed to teach religion this way in the schools, in the public schools. When they cover religion, they're actually instructed. And they use something called the blind men and the elephant, where religion is basically this thing where there's this elephant in the room and everybody's touching a different part of the elephant and the lights are off. And like one person thinks that God is like this and another person thinks that true religion is like this because they're, one person's touching the tusk and one person's touching the foot and one person's touching the head. And so we all get this different idea. There's a few problems with that. First of all, the person who claims the blind man and the elephant scenario is correct, how do you know that? Are the lights on for you and no one else? I might employ skepticism against you. I think I'm going to be skeptical of how you came to know this. But furthermore, there's also good reasons to reject the blind man and the elephant scenario, or the Oprah scenario, because Jesus claimed to be God. Muhammad said Jesus is not God. And like Buddha says nobody exists, not you, not God, not anybody. The Hindus say everybody's God, and the atheists say there is no God. Well, we exist, And Oprah says they're all right. All those are correct. Well, we don't have to, peek outside the door and see that there can't be only one cat and two cats outside. We don't have to see beyond the veil. We can logically analyze this and tell that like there's no way Oprah's correct. There's no way the blind man and the elephant scenario is correct. There's one religion called Baha'i that literally says that all religions are correct. And the problem with Baha'ism is Islam says it's the only true religion. Christianity says it's the only true religion. So like by saying that you're both right, you're also saying that you're both wrong. And so it's just impossible. It's logically impossible. Another example is a statement. I remember seeing this on a commercial. It said ban intolerance. So you should never be intolerant. But if you're going to ban intolerance, then you're being intolerant of intolerant people. And part of this runs into there's two definitions of intolerance. There's the classical definition of intolerance, and there's what's called of classical definition of tolerance, or classical tolerance, and then there's the modern definition of tolerance, or modern tolerance. So classical tolerance says like you have the right to be wrong. I think you're wrong, but you have the right to be wrong. Okay, and I will put up with you believing wrong things. But in the definition of classical tolerance, people are... It assumes that people are wrong and that you believe people to be wrong, but you just allow them the right to be wrong, Whereas modern tolerance goes a step further and says it's wrong to ever believe that anyone is wrong. And the problem with that is that most people believe other people are wrong. So when you say it's wrong to believe anyone's wrong, you just said you believe that all Muslims and all Christians are wrong, which is like almost half the population of the planet. Not to mention all the other people who think that they're right and everyone else is wrong. So that's the problem there. Another example is, let's see, there's hard agnosticism, is self-contradictory. So like I saw a historian writing on he's an agnostic historian who doesn't believe in God. Agnosticism is just basically a word for people who aren't sure if God exists. They don't know. And his name's Bart Ehrman, and he wrote this on his blog, and I don't get to read his blog. You have to pay to read his blog, but it was so interesting. William Lane Craig did a review of the article on. He didn't read the whole thing, but he reviewed what Bart had to say. He has quotes from Bart on his podcast. And so the interesting thing there is sorry, I'm getting a little sleepy. Bart made the error of hard agnosticism, and so you have Bart Ehrman is a doctor. He's a professor of history. He's one of the world's greatest experts in that field, and yet he can make amazingly bad philosophical blunders like this. He says it's impossible to ever know anything about God. Well, I think you see where we're going with this. You have to know something about God to know that. You can't possibly know that it's impossible. You know, you can be agnostic, but you can't be hard agnostic. Hard agnosticism says, I know that no one can know anything about God. That's logically absurd and impossible. You have to retreat to just regular agnosticism, which says, maybe somebody knows something about God. I don't know if they do or not, but, I don't know. That would be just what's called soft agnosticism, or really just, I would just think that that's just agnosticism. But hard agnosticism is logically self-contradictory. And let's move forward to one more example of self-contradictory. What's called verificationism or strong scientism today. Verificationism is the old word, but now it has a derogatory name. And to sum it up briefly, this scientism or strong scientism says that the only source of knowledge, the only thing we can really know, is observations. So they accept all a posteriori knowledge and reject all a priori knowledge. That there is no way to know anything purely mentally, but you can trust observations, and observations are the only source of knowledge, and there are no other sources of knowledge. And the problem is, how do you know that? You knew that through purely mental reasoning, a priori. You didn't observe that. And so it's self-contradictory. And this is why verificationism died. It's there's another form of verificationism called weak scientism, which says that observation is the best source of knowledge and trumps all other sources of knowledge, but it's not the only source of knowledge. And the problem with that is that the conclusions that are reached, because scientism is essentially saying these conclusions of science are the best source of knowledge because they're reached through observation. Observation is how you test your scientific theories and find out if they're correct or not. And while I, as a philosopher, would love to say that you are rationally justified in trusting your observations, nonetheless, it is philosophy that justifies that. Science just makes all sorts of assumptions that in philosophy we actually prove. Like, science assumes all sorts of things, like moral and ethical truths, like, should you report your findings honestly as a scientist? Should you spread rumors about other scientists to damage their work? Does the external world exist? A basic skeptical question. Or are you just a brain in a vat hooked to wires that some scientist somewhere has figured out how to give you a virtual reality world that's completely false? Or like uniformity. Does the world always work according to a set laws? Well, we can't ever know that there's not someplace somewhere where all of a sudden it doesn't work according to set laws of science. Simply because we've observed them a bunch of times, that doesn't prove that that never happened. Or did the universe pop into existence 5 minutes ago with food in our bellies and the appearance of age? In philosophy, we actually deal with these questions. In science, you just assume them. Logical and mathematical truths. They're not proven by science. They're just simply assumed by science. So the problem with weak scientism is that the conclusions of science can never be stronger than the philosophical justification for these more basic skeptical questions and these more basic questions. because science just assumes those and then moves forward. Like, in other words, philosophically, we can prove that you really are rationally justified in trusting observation, but science just assumes that and moves forward. But in philosophy, we actually prove that. That's something we develop.